Welcome back to Football Unspoken. So today, Josh, I've got an interesting one about youth for you today. But before we dive into that, the trivia question I have for you is: can you tell me who was the youngest player to have his debut in the Premier League?
I don't look like an idiot, but I've got to go with, was it Wayne Rooney?
No, it wasn't Wayne Rooney. It's a good shout, but it was actually Aaron Lennon from Tottenham Hotspur.
Wow.
Yeah, Aaron Lennon at 16 years and 129 days played against Southampton.
At least Tottenham finally won something.
So, do you think, with the number of injuries and the fixture congestion, is there scope for there to be a appearance cap on under 21 players in the senior team?
Oh, it's a phenomenal question because the um, I'll give you an answer, but I also need to think it through a little bit in the way that, on the one hand, it's like clearly no, because if the guy's good enough and he's ready to play and you don't know what the future holds, as in, let's say he plays 200 appearances for the club, and then you say, well, you're not allowed to play anymore. And now he turns 21, he turns 22 whenever the cap ends, the age cap ends. And he plays his first game after that and he gets his leg broken. Now he can't play for 3 years. Now you've made him like, so that's a huge consideration of where I'm saying no. But there's so many good examples of players who started debatably, well, not that they started too young, but they were used too often too young, and their bodies couldn't maintain a career, and they ended up effectively falling flat. The examples that come to mind straight away is Michael Owen, Liverpool, Real Madrid, Newcastle. He was playing too many games too young, and he ended up having a whole bunch of hamstring injuries and general body injuries, which ended up making his career basically stop at around 28. I mean, I know he still played at Stoke and all that, but you look at his goal contribution, they fell off a cliff. And it's not just form or ability. He was known for his pace early in his career. And through too many high intensity sprints early in the career, his body couldn't maintain that from about 28 onwards. And then he just became a poacher, which is okay, but he wasn't Michael Owen anymore. Another example is Wayne Rooney. You look at pretty much when we think of Wayne Rooney going to Everton and that being, I mean, he was falling out with Jose Mourinho and Manchester United before he left even for a year or two. So that would have put him at around 26, 27 years old when he fell off at Man United because he only went to the MLS around 30 or 31. And in everyone's head, he was a lot older than that. And that's another example of a player who's played too many games too early. I guess what makes it difficult is you look at the position they play because all the examples I can think of are forwards, high intensity sprinters, guys who are getting fouled a whole lot. Where I can't think of, and I'm sure there's examples, but I can't think of that many center midfielders or defenders who are having those kind of issues. And you can't make it position specific. Like you can't just say, well, forwards can play 100 games, midfielders 200, and defenders 300 or something. Because what would end up happening is managers would get silly with it, where they'd be like, "Oh, I still want to play him, so I'm just going to play him a little bit further back, so I can keep playing him."
All right, fair enough. Well, I think you made a couple of great points there. So I'm going to launch off your points with the agreement, or why it should happen. Which is the fact that there are lots of examples. You look at Eden Hazard's another one who started very young, had loads of minutes when he was under 21, and then became fantastic, and then went to Real Madrid, fell off a cliff. I would also argue if you were going to talk about midfielders, there's a couple I've got in my mind, which is Samir Nasri. He played a load of minutes when he was under 21, and I think his career petered out probably 5, 6 years before it should have. Another one in my mind is Cesc Fabregas. I genuinely think his end of his career was hampered because, again, he did fall under a lot of injuries. Um, and he went to Chelsea. He had a good time at Chelsea, but I don't think he was fantastic. I think, especially towards the end, he never struck me as a player who's going to put that much fear into the opposition like he did when he was at Arsenal or prime Barcelona. And then went to Monaco and kind of again, Monaco didn't do much. Como didn't do much. He did retire at 36, but again, it felt like his kind of career was over 6 years earlier. And for 30 years old, being a centre mid feels very young to be being pushed out of top tier European sides for a player of Cesc Fabregas's ability. The one thing that's often not considered is the mental load. There is a lot of pressure at these top clubs because the other thing is that these players that I'm talking about, more often than not, they're not playing for, you know, Sunderland and like Como and those kind of players are often playing for teams that have Champions League ties, 50,000 people stadiums, loads riding on every single game. And there's a lot of mental pressure and build up. And I don't think at 16, 17 years old, you're kind of prepared to deal with the backlash of it not going well. And one person who I'm going to give a load of credit to is Bukayo Saka. I think he's dealt with an obscene amount of pressure added to the racism that he's dealt with. He's a boy who I think has dealt with more than anything from under 21, and unfortunately now he's got his big injury that a lot of people, not in a oh, I'm waiting for him to get injured, but a lot of people have been talking about him potentially getting injured for years now because he plays every single game.
Easier example to give, which is Jack Wilshere. He was playing in Arsenal's first team from 17 years old, particularly around 2010 or so when he first came through. He was playing a lot of minutes. And by the age of 28 or so, he had to retire. He had so many injuries. He tried to go to West Ham, he tried to go to Bournemouth. He just ended up having to retire. I was going to say resign. He had to end up retiring because he had just so many injuries. And what I am noticing with all the examples that both you and I are giving, it's the specific players who are drawing a lot of fouls and a lot of close contact football. All of those fouls build up when you're playing, like I said, maybe 30 games a season, and you're, absorbing 300 fouls a season then for 10 years, from 16 to 26 or something, it builds up with your body. And particularly around the joints, which is where majority of those injuries are going to happen that are going to prevent a player from recovering and carrying on with their career. One other player I'm concerned about from a Newcastle perspective, he's been playing for a long time and gets a lot of injury, or not so many injuries, a lot of fouls, is Anthony on the wing. Is that a player you're concerned about having to potentially not retire earlier than we've seen the injuries come yet? But he, to me, is almost like a year or two behind Bukayo Saka in terms of you're just waiting for him to get a big injury, not because you want him to, but because the amount of fouls he goes through per game, and he plays every game for Newcastle at the minute.
Yeah, I think fouls are a big thing. I think in terms of Anthony Gordon, there is the concern. The concern I would say around it is because a lot of these youth players who play all these minutes and then get their big injuries or retire early, a lot of them are muscular at the end of the day, and I'm not massively concerned with a muscular injury with Anthony Gordon, just because yeah he's still young, but I think he's only really started becoming a star player and like a big name in the last season and a half, really. His last season at Everton when he started getting a bit of noise, but he's not a player who started at 17, 18 playing pretty regularly. And I think by the time you're 21, 22 and you start playing regularly, your body's a bit more prepared for it. So I think that's the big difference. And this is why I say the cutoff for the cap for me would be 20 to 21. Because I think your body is now prepared to deal with that situation. Plus, you're mentally able to prepare. The one player that I didn't mention, who I wanted to talk about, was Dele Alli. Dele Alli is another player who started quite young. I don't think he started as young as everyone else, but he was the next big thing. And he, unfortunately, mentally, I think he's lost it. There's a couple of injuries there, but I think it's a big thing about mentally. He's been in a bit of a state, and I think that's one of the big side effects, one of the big repercussions of these youth players playing that isn't spoken about enough. So I think that is one thing I'd potentially look at as a bit of an issue when it comes to the youth players. But moving on from that, is there? I'll now go with the other side of it because there are a couple of players who started young and then did develop very fantastically. And you're looking at guys like Ronaldo. Ronaldo, he made what 80 odd appearances before the age of 20. It might have, or something. It might have even been young. It might have been 17 or 18. How old Lamine Yamal is now? But what he played 70 games or so. Lamine Yamal has played 65 games. So there are definitely the outliers, and you kind of do look at it and you think, do you really want to not be playing Cristiano Ronaldo and Lamine Yamal? Is there a situation where you would avoid playing them?
Yeah, do you know what's really funny is I feel like I've talked myself over to the side of potentially they should look to cap it a little bit. I don't know, you're asking now on the other side, but I just want to round that out because there are two more points to make on that. The first one is you look at how Pep Guardiola manages young players. Now, I know Pep's not everyone's cup of tea at the moment with the way the Manchester City are playing this season, but you look at how he managed Foden. I think in the end, everyone would agree over the long period of 5 years, where really in the beginning, he hardly got a game, hardly got a game. And then he started to get more and more, and he was then in the team. You can say, oh, it was an ability, it was a skill issue. But realistically, I think it was more of a, not a physical issue, then he had to grow. But protecting a player like Phil Foden, who incurs a lot of fouls throughout a game, protecting him at a younger age until he got to around 21, which is exactly what you're saying. The body needs to develop. He clearly had the skills to be able to be playing at 17, 18, particularly in a Man City team that dominates possession. That Pep protected him. And one other example, you were talking about Dele Alli. Now, a manager who gave Dele Alli a lot of advice around his career was Jose Mourinho. There's that famous interview with him on the All or Nothing series where Mourinho says, if you don't basically pull up your socks, you're going to regret it because your life passes you by quickly. But another player that Jose Mourinho spoke about was Rashford, not, and this was after he was at Manchester United. He was in studio, and one of the other presenters said, "Oh, Rashford, he's a young player, he's still got lots to learn." Rashford was around 22, 23, and Mourinho disagreed for the reason that Rashford has been playing since he was 17, and he's been starting since he was 17, meaning that by the time he's 22, he's been playing in the Premier League and Champions League for 5 years straight at that point. That's the same as a player who only joins the Premier League at 20 and plays till 25. And you'd say the player at 25, oh, he's a mature player. Rashford has the same amount of experience at 22 as the average Premier League player has at 25, 26 by CAC level. So you'd Mourinho's point is once you've learned after 5 years, you don't learn that much more after 5 seasons in the Premier. I don't think you can't improve. You can always improve, but it's not this, like in the gym, you call it noob gains. Your noob gains are far behind you in the Premier League once you've played probably 2 or 3 seasons, to be honest. You know what it's about, you know what the opposition are doing, etc. And so I think Mourinho actually had a really good point there that Rashford, pretty much after 2023, didn't have much of a margin to grow from that. And that comes back to your point around if you're putting these youth players in at 16, 17 every game for a couple of seasons, by the time they're 22, they're like a full grown Premier League player, which sounds like a good thing. But for longevity, it probably doesn't help them, as you said, from the mental side. Then to answer your question around the positives to do, as I said, there's lots of examples outside of striker and wing, I would say, where there's players who've played since a very young age and actually managed to do it consistently season after season. I mean, even Sergio Ramos is a great example of a flying right back who became a more composed centre back throughout his career alongside Pepe. So, and goalkeepers, there's plenty of those like Donnarumma who started at a very young age. And I mean, his career hasn't finished yet, but you can see him playing into his 30s as well.
Yeah, I do think that's a fair point, and maybe it is something that needs to be looked at on a position basis. But I guess the thing that you have with strikers and wingers is that being quick and tricky and light and having confidence is such a massive part of being a winger. And when you're youth, they talk about the exuberance of youth a lot, don't they? When it comes to these players, and I think having that definitely helps. So maybe a good example would be Gavi. Gavi at Barcelona is a young, quite a young player who started very young, and he's running that midfield very well. Is there any concern for him and maybe Lamine Yamal that they could end up in this situation where they do get 5, 6 years in, and mentally it's just becoming a big toll? Because that's the big thing about being a centre back and being a midfield. Mentally, you have to be on a different level you have to have a different understanding of the game than your strikers and your wingers do.
Yeah. I think Lamal is going to fall off by the time he gets to his late 20s in the way that he's just going to encumber too many fouls in his early years. People are going to target him and they're going to start kicking him and intentionally just fouling the player, which is going to take a toll on him by 27, 28. And I'd be surprised if he's still at Barcelona by the time he's 30. And I don't think he's going to go to another superior club than that. I think he would go to something like an Osasuna, for example. Where Gavi, he reminds me of the kind of player of a Xavi or Iniesta style, where it's more receivable passes, and that's a lot. not easier as in the skill set is easier, but it's a lot easier to manage the physical element and the physical demands of that play style there. And he also suits stuff that Barcelona is all about, right? Pass and move. So he is a Barcelona talisman, in my opinion. I can see him starting and finishing his career at Barcelona.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. The last point I wanted to make was just right now, Lamine Yamal has, I believe, has about 65, 66 appearances under his belt. At the same age, Lionel Messi had 34. So I think there has to be something said about Pep Guardiola understanding the needs of a youth player when you look at how he handled Messi, when you look at how he's handled Phil Foden. So I do agree with you there. But I think overall this has been a very interesting discussion. I think you've kind of talked yourself around to maybe having a cap. It might be interesting if you want to give us a last thought on that.
Yeah, no, once I've thought about it a bit more, I did think you made a point earlier around if you made it percentage based in terms of a player under the age of 21 can only play 50% start, let's say, can only start 50% or 75% of the team's matches in each competition or something along those lines would be something worth investigating for the best interest of the players.
Yeah, I think that's where I kind of landed as well. I think maybe looking to reduce the number of starts that they have, creating a percentage or a cap on an exact number of starts, and from there they have to appear from the bench would be an interesting thing to investigate. But we'd love to hear what you guys think. Would a cap on under 21 players make sense? Or is it something that just won't work in modern football and the way football works? Leave us a comment, let us know your thoughts. And until next time, this has been Football Unspoken. Cheers.